Zach Andrews was a man of God, or so it seemed. Every Sunday, he stood at the pulpit of his small-town church, delivering sermons about morality, family values, and the importance of living a righteous life. His wife, Stacey, sat in the front pew, her hands neatly folded in her lap, her smile serene and unwavering. She was the epitome of the perfect pastor's wife, devout, supportive, and always impeccably dressed. Together, they appeared to be the ideal family, a shining example of faith and love. But behind closed doors, their home was a prison of fear, pain, and secrets. Stacey had long since stopped recognizing the man she married. Zach's temper had always been short, but over the years his anger had grown into something monstrous. He wielded control like a weapon, using an electric cord to punish anyone who dared to defy him. Stacey bore the brunt of his rage, her body often marked with welts and bruises hidden beneath her modest clothing. She had learned to endure the abuse in silence, her faith telling her to forgive and her fear telling her to obey. But the intimacy between them had died years ago, replaced by a cold, unspoken resentment. Zach's cruelty extended beyond his wife. Late at night, after Stacey had fallen asleep and their son, Don, was buried in schoolwork in his room, Zach would turn his attention to their daughter, Linda. On scorching summer days, when the sun blazed mercilessly, Zach would lock Linda outside the house, refusing to let her in to eat, drink, or even use the bathroom. Linda, just 14 years old, would sit on the porch, her skin burning under the relentless heat, her throat parched, and her stomach growling. She would beg to be let back in, but Zach would ignore her pleas, his face a mask of cold indifference. Linda's tears would mix with the sweat on her face as she wondered what she had done to deserve such punishment. Don, just 2 years older than Linda, had seen too much. One afternoon, while heading to the kitchen for a glass of water, he had glimpsed Linda sitting on the porch, her face red and her lips cracked from dehydration. The sight had filled him with a rage he couldn't articulate. He had heard her quiet sobs through the open window, and he knew what was happening. But Don was just a boy, and Zach was a towering figure of authority, both in their home and in their community. Don felt helpless, his anger turning inward, festering into a deep hatred for his father and a gnawing guilt for not being able to protect his sister. As the years passed, the Andrews family unraveled. Don, unable to cope with the trauma, turned to drugs and alcohol, seeking solace in the numbness they provided. He drifted from one boyfriend to another, each relationship as tumultuous and fleeting as the last. Linda, haunted by the abuse she endured, repeated the cycle of pain. By the time she was 25, she had 4 children, but her own unresolved trauma made her incapable of being the mother they needed. Her kids were taken away by social services, and Linda spiraled into addiction, her life a mirror of her brother's. Zach's death came suddenly, a heart attack that struck him down in the middle of a sermon. The church mourned the loss of their beloved pastor, but for Stacey, Don, and Linda, his passing was a complicated mix of relief and unresolved pain. At the funeral, Stacey sat in the front pew, her face a mask of grief. She had spent decades playing the role of the perfect wife, even as her life crumbled around her. Now, with Zach gone, she felt adrift, her identity tied to a man she had long since stopped loving. Don arrived at the funeral with his husband Leo. The two had been together for a year, their relationship one of the few stable things in Don's life. But even Leo couldn't quell the storm inside Don. As the service ended and the mourners filed out, Don lingered by the coffin. His eyes fell on the expensive watch on Zach's wrist, a symbol of the control and power his father had wielded even in death. In a moment of defiance, Don slipped the watch off Zach's cold, dead wrist and pocketed it. Leo, ever the accomplice, didn't stop him, but their theft didn't go unnoticed. A church member saw the act and called the police, who arrived just as Don and Leo were leaving. The two were arrested, their actions a final desperate rebellion against the man who had destroyed their lives. Stacey watched in stunned silence as her son was led away in handcuffs. Her heart ached not just for Don, but for Linda, who hadn't shown up to the funeral. Stacey had tried to reach her, but Linda had been unreachable for years, lost in a haze of drugs and self-destruction. As the police car drove off, Stacey stood alone in the church parking lot, the weight of her family's brokenness pressing down on her. Meanwhile, miles away, Linda lay in a dingy apartment, her body succumbing to a drug overdose. The funeral she had chosen to avoid was happening without her, but in her final moments she thought of her father, not with love, but with a bitter clarity. Zach's legacy was one of pain, a cycle of abuse that had consumed them all. As her vision faded, Linda wondered if her children would remember her, or if they too would be lost to the shadows she had never escaped. And so, the Andrews family's story ended not with redemption, but with the stark reality of the damage one man's cruelty had wrought. Zach's death brought no closure, only a painful reminder of the lives he had shattered. In the end, the perfect family he had portrayed was nothing more than a lie, a facade that had hidden the truth for far too long.